Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. We have a special episode coming your way today. This is going to be our best ball fantasy football strategy show for the 2024 season. So best ball fantasy football is one of the, in my opinion, most fun and certainly one of the fastest growing forms of fantasy football that is available to play right now. And so what we're going to do here on this show is we're going to break it down, give you the ins and outs of what the formats are and some strategies that you can use and some tools that you can use so that whether you are a beginner or a little bit intermediate, a little bit of experience or advanced in drafting for best ball fantasy football, you're going to get some information and some strategy here on this show that can help you win in best ball in the 2024 season. As a high school math teacher, one of the things that I am uniquely qualified to do is take something that is very complicated and explain it so that anybody can understand it. So whether you are completely new to best ball or if you've done it a lot, hopefully this episode is going to help you not only understand what the format of best ball is, but also how to construct your team and how to draft your team in a way that is going to help you win big money in the 2024 season. Now, before we continue, I do want to mention that the two biggest best ball sites right now are Underdog and DraftKings. And so those are going to be the two that we're primarily going to focus on here on this show today. If you are not a member of either of those two sites, check out the description if you're listening on audio or if you are watching on YouTube, because we've got a link to a referral that can get you a deposit match or a free $20 if you click the link and use my referral code. So if you are not a member of either of those two sites and you want to get best ball drafting on there, make sure you check that out. I cannot recommend enough. It's basically free money. Like if you were to do the Underdog one and get a deposit match, say you just wanted to draft $25 worth of teams, use my code and now you can draft $50 worth of teams, no hassle. So if you are looking to sign up for either of those two sites, please use those codes in the description. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and hop on in with the video. Like I said, we're going to break down the format of best ball and then some strategy that you can use in order to help draft the best team. So no matter what your experience level is, you can get something here out of this video and get better at best ball for the 2024 season. Because if I'm being honest, best ball was a slightly profitable venture for me in 2023. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot to do that, but it takes a really good understanding of just how you can be profitable in best ball and how to draft your team so that you can set up for an entirely profitable year, especially if you are drafting multiple teams. So that's partly what we're going to talk about here on the show today. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in and let's go ahead and talk about the format of best ball and how it got started and how it has continued to grow. All right, so if you were watching this, you may or may not have already heard of best ball fantasy football, but I can give you kind of the gist of how it got started. So basically, if you have played season-long fantasy football, that is the origins of best ball at its core. Pretty much just the game that we all know and love, season-long fantasy football, that kind of got best ball started, right? So what a lot of people used to do for season-long fantasy football, and there are people that still do this, is they do mock where you kind of join a lobby and you draft a team and there's no real kind of investment in it. You're just drafting to see, hey, I got this pick, here are the guys that are available, here are the guys that I like, and kind of able to plan it out that way. But the problem was with mock drafts was that it was not super reliable in terms of the ADPs that you were getting it, or the feel of drafting, because nobody had any sort of investment in it. Everybody was just doing it for free one time. You'd have people that ended up on auto draft, you'd have people that take guys completely off the board. And so really just the information people were getting from mock drafts wasn't great. So what best ball sprung out of was the idea of, hey, let's do a mock draft where you don't have to worry about it after you draft, but we put a little bit of money into a pot and we award a winner at the end of the season. So that way, everybody has a little bit of investment in this mock draft, right? And so that is the core of what started best ball. Best ball is a quote unquote draft it and forget it game. Basically what happens is when you sign up to draft the best ball team on Underdog, DraftKings, or wherever else, you have the draft. And then you don't have to do anything with that team the entire rest of the season. There are waivers, trades, or setting lineups week in and week out. What ends up happening is every week in a best ball lineup, it will automatically start your top quarterback, top 2 running backs, top 3 wide receivers, top tight end, and top flex, and maybe even additional positions if you have a certain rule set, but that's generally the standard. But it'll automatically start those guys for you. You don't have to set a lineup. You don't have to worry about guys being hurt. You don't get to add or drop players. So it's just super simple. Draft it and forget it and watch your team score the points. Now, the way that the season works is you don't have head-to-head matchups either. It's a cumulative weekly starting lineup. So every week you get awarded points based off of your starting lineup. And so what ends up happening is over the course of the season, the team that accumulates the most points over the course of the season ends up winning. Now, the most common form of best ball has become tournaments, which have become super popular. Underdog does one called Best Ball Mania, where it's $25 entry. DraftKings does their Best Ball Millionaire, which is a $20 entry this year. And then Underdog and DraftKings have all kinds of bigger and smaller dollar value tournaments. The way the tournaments work are, everything that we just said applies to the tournament, but it stops after week 14. And it usually advances the top 2 teams out of a 12-team draft to the playoffs after that week 14. And then what you get is usually 2 rounds of playoffs in week 15 and week 16, where again, it kind of, segments, a portion of the teams that way only a certain amount advance to the next round. And then a final in week 17, where in Best Ball Mania and DraftKings Best Ball Millionaire, the winner of that week 17 final is getting over $1 million, which is crazy, right? Now, last year, I did a lot of best ball drafts over the summer because I basically would wake up every morning and run on my elliptical and fire up a best ball draft on DraftKings or Underdog, and then draft it while I was running on my elliptical. And then, when I was done drafting, I'd end my run, right? And so I ended up drafting a lot of teams, and I had one make it to a final. It was a $4 draft on Underdog that made it to a final. And just that one draft making it to a final enabled me to be profitable for the entire year, because it is really hard to make a final. Like, if you get teams into these finals, you're doing a really good job. And so what we're going to talk about here in this show is kind of the micro and macro strategies that can help you win in, standard best ball leagues, but in addition to these tournaments where you're going to want to have a high scoring lineup in week 15, 16, and 17, because, you don't really know what you're going to be going up against in these playoffs in week 15, 16, 17, and you may need a pretty big week to end up advancing to the next stage. Now, the macro strategy of best ball, the biggest piece of advice I can give is about maximizing your weekly ceiling to have as many big scoring weeks as you possibly can. Only the top players on your roster are going to start. So what you're going to want is to have those top players be the top scoring players. You're going to want to have, quarterbacks who end the week in, the top 5, top 3, top 1 score at their position, running backs who end in the top 10, receivers who end in the top 10, and so on, right? You want to have these big scoring weeks, and you want to maximize as much scoring weeks as you possibly can. It's also important to note that you're not drafting your whole team to start in 1 week. So like when you draft 2 quarterbacks, having one quarterback score 30 and the other quarterback score 2 earns you points than if you had 2 quarterbacks 20 points, because the one that scored 30 is the one that is counting, whereas if 2 of them score 20, you're still getting just that 20 points. So you want to target super high ceiling players. For quarterbacks, that tends to be the more mobile quarterbacks. For skill players, there are really 2 paths to a high weekly ceiling, which are being high volume players, guys such as like Rashad White for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who just gets carry after carry after carry, or guys who have big playability like Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins, who can break off a 90-yard run at any moment's notice and give you an instant 16 fantasy points and instantly start on your best ball team just based off of 1 carry. But the bottom line is this: when you play these tournaments, the team that has the most ceiling weeks in weeks 1 through 14 usually advances out of the group and into the playoffs, whereas the team that has the ceiling weeks in the playoffs, those are the teams that end up winning the big money. So the bottom line is you want to set your team up so that way you can have a ceiling week, high ceiling, high scoring players as many weeks as possible out of the 17-week season. Now, the biggest strategy and the biggest piece of advice I can give for best ball in order to obtain that is with what's known as stacking. If you are a veteran of playing best ball, you know what I'm talking about with stacking, but I'm going to explain the math behind stacking and why it matters. So stacking is when you draft a quarterback with at least 1 wide receiver or 1 tight end on their team. Oftentimes, this is done with more than 1 receiving option. 2, 3, 4 receiving options between the receivers and tight ends on that team. The math behind stacking is you want to increase your correlation. What that means is this: when you stack, if your quarterback has a big game, then it is highly likely that 1 or more of their receivers also had a big game. And vice versa. If your receiver has a big game, it's very highly likely that the quarterback throwing to them had a big game. So when you stack, you're going to get both of those players have their ceiling weeks at the exact same time and instantly put the 2 of them into your starting lineup. And so you can draft multiple stacks on the same roster because you get 18 roster spots on Underdog and 20 on DraftKings. So you can draft multiple stacks and end up, just hoping that, these different teams have different ceiling weeks and you end up with a ceiling week every week of the season. But the math behind this is pretty simple. Just think about this example. If a quarterback in a game goes 20 for 30, which is kind of a modest completion percentage in today's NFL, for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns, that is 24 fantasy points on Underdog. That's pretty good, right? Like that's probably going to be a starter for you most weeks. That's probably going to be a top 6, top 5 quarterback most weeks more often than not, right? Now, if a quarterback has that stat line between the completed passes, the yards, and the touchdowns, this players for that quarterback, who he's throwing to, scored a total of 58 points in that game. And that's not accounting for any rushing yards or any, return touchdowns that they might have gotten. So basically, if you think about a team that plays, the same 3 receivers and 1 tight end, and a quarterback scores 58 fantasy points for those 4 players, then that's an average of over 14 points for those 4 players. And likely it's not exactly, evenly distributed. And you're very likely to have 2 of those players go for over 20 points. So that is why you want to stack, is when your quarterback ends up going off, their receiving options end up going off. Now, best ball has 2 different modes of thinking. We're going to take a quick breather and then talk about that. Now, these 2 modes of thinking are very kind of opposite, but also they kind of both make sense. So, there's kind of 2 components to best ball. And the first component is advancing your teams to the playoffs from your draft, from your pod, right? And then the next component is, how can I win big money in the playoffs? And so there's kind of 2 different ways that you can set up your team in order to advance the most teams, but also how can you get those advancing teams to actually win big money? Because last year I ended up having a super high advance rate, which gave me plenty of shots, plenty of opportunities to advance teams to the finals. And like I said, I only got 1. That's how difficult it is to do this. So if you want to just advance the most teams to the playoffs, it boils down to just drafting the best players, quite frankly. And so we're going to talk about here in just a second how you can, set up everything in order to draft the best players, which is much easier said than done. Now, how can you win big money in the playoffs? Is to have the setup for the highest weekly ceiling possible, because the bottom line is whoever has the highest ceiling week in week 17 is the team that's going to end up walking away with $1 million in Best Ball Mania and DraftKings Best Ball Millionaire. So the reason why we mentioned stacking first is because stacking is a part of both of those modes of thinking. In terms of drafting the best players, it's very likely that if a quarterback or a wide receiver has a big year, that, if it's a quarterback a big year, and if it's a wide receiver, their quarterback has a big year. So, drafting the best stacks is going to be a part of getting teams that end up advancing out of your group. And then in terms of having a setup for a high weekly ceiling, stacking is a big part of that. Anecdotally, last year, Tyreek Hill was one of the best first-round picks in all of best ball, and I believe his ADP was around 3 to 4-ish. So a lot of guys, drafted Tyreek with their first pick, understandably. And Tyreek Hill was hurt in week 15 in the first week of the best ball playoffs. So all these teams that had Tyreek Hill ended up being a 0 for his spot, right? And so what ended up happening was, if you had Tyreek Hill, then you likely needed to have some other Dolphins, offensive weapons on that team in order to overcome the points that Tyreek Hill would have gotten for you. And so a Dolphin stack was still able to get to the next round because you weren't just dependent on one guy to score you a ton of fantasy points. Also last year, Amari Cooper having a big week in week 15 ended up advancing a lot of teams to the weekly playoffs. And that's just kind of a bit luck that one guy could randomly go off and advance a whole lot of teams. But then in week 17, all these teams that have Amari Cooper are sitting in the finals with you. And so how can you differentiate yourself between all these other Amari Cooper teams if Amari Cooper is the one that ended up, having the big week? So there's all kinds of variables that are in play there. Now that we've, best ball has been around for a few years, now there's enough of a sample size that we really can make a little bit of a model for success and have a little bit of tools and strategies that can help you get there. This game is still not fully solved, though. If anybody claims to 100% have the answers for best ball, they're lying to you. I'm not claiming to have 100% of the answers, but I am claiming to have strategies and tools that can generally help set you up for success and help you be profitable playing best ball. So let's first talk about drafting the best players. So remember, first off, that when you go into a draft on Underdog or DraftKings, you can see the ADP of every player that's in the draft. ADP is a reactive measurement, not a proactive measurement. What that means is ADP is showing you where all these players have been drafted over all of the drafts that have been done on draft. Underdog. It is not showing you where they should be drafted on DraftKings or Underdog. So if you want to, import your own rankings or import rankings from a website like Establish the Run, that's a very wise strategy so that way you can kind of get advantage on ADP. I'm going to be having my own best ball rankings on my Patreon very shortly. That's patreon.com/MikesMoneyPicks. But they are not available yet. But the rankings and having rankings can allow you to get a leg up on ADP. What I recommend using ADP to predict who will be available at your next pick as opposed to who to draft at your current pick. Do not be afraid to scroll down and take somebody who's not at the top of ADP when you are drafting, because if you're taking somebody who's at the top of ADP, then what that's doing is that's creating a very common build for you and whoever else is sitting in your same spot, because you're just taking the best player available. So do not be afraid to scroll down a little bit and take guys that are a little bit off the board. Also, remember that ADP is going to move throughout draft season. There are guys that have ADPs now in May that are not going to have that same ADP come August. And that goes for both directions. Guys are going to rise and guys are going to fall. So keep that in mind, that if you're drafting for, a big contest like Best Ball Mania or Best Ball Millionaire, that by drafting a team right now, you can end up with a build that is going to be different than one that you can be able to draft in July or August, simply because those players are not going to be available at those picks in July or August. So my number one recommendation for drafting the best players is, behind using rankings and using ADP, when it comes to setting your own rankings or when it comes to drafting your own players, I like to evaluate players in terms of three ranges of outcomes. I want to evaluate what, a player has for their floor outcome, for their median outcome, what is most likely to happen, and their ceiling outcome, what is the best possible thing that could happen. And when you think back to last year, the two guys that really won people a lot of money in best ball were Puka Nacua and Kyron Williams. And I was fortunate that I had Puka Nacua on a lot of different teams, but believe it or not, he was not on my one team that made the finals. Go figure, right? And so when I was drafting Puka, I was doing that same evaluation of like, hey, this guy's being drafted at the very end of drafts, and his floor is he's a guy who never plays. The median outcome is he could be a starting receiver on one of the league's better offenses, and the ceiling was he could become prime Cooper Kupp if Cooper Kupp ever got injured. And guess what ended up happening? He pretty much became Cooper Kupp while Cooper Kupp was still playing for the Rams. And so, finding a guy like that is going to be instrumental in, having success in best ball. But that's the evaluation that I use is, hey, what is this guy's floor? What is this guy's median? And what is this guy's ceiling? And I want to try to draft players when they're being drafted at their floor. Puka Nacua was free in drafts last year because he had at the very end in the last round. So that's just an example from last year. Looking ahead to this year, and I'm going to be going over more of my player evaluations as the offseason gets going. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Make sure you're subscribed to the audio feeds. That way you can get all of those evaluations as they roll out. But just here's an example evaluation of a running back that I think is being slightly undervalued right now, and a guy that I've drafted in best ball already this year. That's Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. So in terms of his three outcomes, his floor outcome is the second string running back on a mediocre offense in the Cleveland Browns that gets passing down work, because let's be honest, Nick Chubb is not going to be out there catching 60 balls a year. So Jerome Ford's floor outcome is still a guy who's going to be getting snaps and getting balls thrown to him, right? Jerome Ford's median outcome is a running back by committee member of an average to above average offense. To me, the median outcome for Jerome Ford is what Kareem Hunt was for the 3 years where he was in Cleveland, where he's a fringe top 30, top 20 running back and is able to give you a few weeks when he actually springs through and gets touchdowns. Jerome Ford's ceiling outcome, if Nick Chubb does not recover from this injury well, is the RB1 on one of the best rushing attacks in the league. If we're being honest, Cleveland is going to be one of the run-heavy teams in the league. And if Nick Chubb does not come back well from the terrible injury, Jerome Ford could be the guy. And Jerome Ford is the guy. He's a guy that you're going to want in your team. So this is a guy with a very high ceiling who is being drafted outside the top 40 running backs right now. So that's a guy that I'm definitely signing up for and definitely taking in early best ball drafts. Another guy who I feel the same way about is Jonathan Brooks of the Carolina Panthers. He's the running back that I feel very highly right now, and I'm certainly willing to take him at his current ADP. Now, an example evaluation at the wide receiver position. is Chiefs wide receiver Xavier Worthy. So Xavier Worthy is an interesting one to me because he's currently being drafted around pick 60 on Underdog, but I still think that he's being drafted closer to his floor or his median outcome than his ceiling. So Xavier Worthy, the floor outcome is he is a low volume starting wide receiver on one of the league's best offenses. So his floor outcome is he is this year's Valdez Scantling or Justin Watson. And even those guys, when they broke free for a deep touchdown or when they had just a random high volume game, they still gave you games where they could be starters in a best ball format. So Xavier Worthy's floor outcome is still a guy who's going to end up starting for you a few weeks of the season. Xavier Worthy's median outcome, as the fastest player ever at the NFL Combine, is a big play threat who plays every snap for one of the league's best offenses. And, if he breaks off a few of those big plays, he's going to instantly start for those weeks where he does. And knowing Andy Reid and knowing Kansas City, I think that they're going to look to get him the football. And so that kind of goes to, Worthy's ceiling out. Xavier Worthy's ceiling outcome is prime Tyreek Hill, if we're being honest. Tyreek Hill was not a better college player than Xavier Worthy. Just point blank, Xavier Worthy was a very productive wide receiver at Texas who had pretty good metrics. And if Quinn Ewers had connected on a few more deep balls, Xavier Worthy might have been a top 10 pick. But that's beside the point. Xavier Worthy's ceiling is a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football because of the speed and because of the dynamicism that he has when the ball is in his hands and how the Chiefs have a history of using players of his archetype. So Xavier Worthy being drafted around pick 60 is currently being much closer to his floor and his median than his ceiling. This is a guy that I want to be targeting in drafts right now. A wide receiver, though, that is on the other end of the spectrum, this is a guy that I will not be drafting anytime soon, is Malik Neighbors, rookie wide receiver for the New York Giants out of LSU. So Malik Neighbors' floor outcome is a starting wide receiver on one of the league's worst passing offenses. I don't see a scenario where Malik Neighbors doesn't start, but to me, the floor is this team is just not effective passing the football. The median outcome for Malik Neighbors is he ends up being the most targeted or second most targeted receiver on a league average passing offense. With Daniel Jones returning from injury, do the Giants return to being an average passing offense? I don't know. I think that's a possibility, and I think if they do, Malik Neighbors is likely the leading or second leading target earner. Malik Neighbors' ceiling outcome this year is a high volume wide receiver 1 on an above average passing offense, which would only lead him to being a fringe wide receiver 1 in fantasy. Keep in mind that I think this ceiling outcome is even reaching a little bit. Daniel Jones has never had a wide receiver reach 800 yards in a season. And so Malik Neighbors could be the very first one to do so. And to me, that's a little bit of a red flag, right? I definitely want, that passing offense to have a little bit more of a pedigree to feel confident taking Malik Neighbors. But I mentioned his ceiling outcome is a fringe wide receiver 1 in fantasy. And guess where he's being drafted at right now on Underdog? Wide receiver 12. So you're drafting Malik Neighbors at his ceiling as opposed to his floor, which to me is not a good get. To me, I would much rather be drafting somebody at their floor than at their ceiling. All right, so let's take a quick breather. Enough about player evaluations. Let's now talk about how we can establish a big weekly ceiling to help you win the big bucks. All right, so that is how you can evaluate and find the best players in drafts. But now, how can you give yourself a weekly ceiling that is going to allow you to win money in week 15, 16, and 17 in playoff best ball formats, right? So the first one's kind of obvious. You want to draft players with a high ceiling, like, what we talked about, where, you're doing that evaluation and you want guys who have a ceiling of being a top 10 at their position kind of guy, no matter where you draft them. If you can talk yourself into a situation where they become a top 10 guy at their position, then that's a guy that you're probably going to want on your roster. Now, also, I like to have guys with a high weekly ceiling. So, that means that you want to draft guys who could have an expanded role as the season goes on, or guys who are big play threats, like we already talked about with like Xavier Worthy. But, you want to have guys who just have the ability to go nuclear at any moment and hope and pray that in week 15 and 16 and 17, that they are on your roster when they go nuclear. Because like I said, last year, pretty much everybody who had Amari Cooper was able to advance to the next round after the week that he went absolutely off. Now, also, one thing that we already mentioned stacking. I like the idea of stacking multiple teams on the same roster. This gives you multiple outs because, if one team, if you built your offense or if you built your roster around one stack of one offense, then what happens when that offense doesn't have a big game? You're going to need somebody else to pick up the slack. And so if you stack multiple offenses on the same draft, then you're giving yourself multiple outs, yourself multiple opportunities that even if one team doesn't work out, you're able to pick up some fancy points and hopefully get some big points from that other stack. With the team that I was mentioning that made it to the final last year, I actually had a Brown stack and a Saints stack on these same rosters. And what was interesting was with the Brown stack, I had Deshaun Watson, who obviously got hurt mid-season, but because I had stacked the Browns guys, when Joe Flacco came in, Amari Cooper and David Njoku were great targets for that offense. And for this part of it, Derek Carr, believe it or not, along with Chris Olave and Alvin Kamara, I think I had on this roster as well, were really good down the stretch of last season and really carried me when I didn't have those points from Deshaun Watson to rely on. And so I was able to, have enough good things go right that with that Amari Cooper, I was able to have a big week. Now, also, one advanced strategy that is recommended by a lot of content creators that I'm yet to really see the absolute necessity in doing so is to game stack week 15, 16, or 17 once the NFL schedule drops. Meaning, if you have a stack of an offense, and you can find who they're playing in week 15, 16, or 17, drafting players on the opposing team, because what would happen is if that offense is going off, it's likely to create a game environment where the other offense is likely to have to score a lot of points to keep up. And so if you end up rostering a lot of guys from a game that happens to end up 45-42, well, then you're going to end up, absolutely destroying because you have all the pieces from that game, right? I don't think that this is super necessary, because it does add a slight bit of correlation. It definitely does give you a few more outs, like we talked about, to having a ceiling week. But the problem is it would really force you to draft outside of like just general player evaluation, which is something I don't really do very often. This is something to me that I would use as a tiebreaker, or if I see it come up, if I see an opportunity come up at a good value, I will take it. But it's not something that I'm going out of my way to do. I'm drafting first off, considering my stacks and considering my player evaluations, as opposed to game stacking week 15, 16, and 17. Another thing that's a little bit of a niche with this strategy is picking which game to stack does not matter. We have no idea what defenses are going to end up being good in the NFL this season. We have no idea really what offenses are going to end up being good in the NFL this season. So when it comes to picking a game to stack, I would not recommend starting off a draft and being like, hey, the Chiefs and the Chargers are playing week 17. I'm going to get all Chiefs and Chargers. No, that's not necessarily how it works. You never know which game is going to end up going off and being the game that ends up being the highest scoring game of the week. So do not feel that you need to do that, but that is going to be a strategy that you can absolutely employ in your drafts once the NFL schedule comes out. They can give you an extra bit of correlation and an extra few outs to having a ceiling week in the best ball playoffs. Now, it would not be a best ball strategy show if I did not mention the zero RB strategy. This is the strategy that is used by a lot of best ball content creators and a lot of high-level drafters on Underdog and DraftKings will champion this strategy and kind of make it seem that this is the strategy to go. Anecdotally, last year, the winner of Best Ball Mania 4 was a zero RB drafter, but does that mean that that's going to happen that way every year? Probably not. A lot of the teams that advanced to the finals of Best Ball Mania 4 last year were Christian McCaffrey teams. So, you kind of have a little bit of dichotomy there of, teams that have a really good running back or teams that didn't draft a running back at all. But anyway, the zero RB strategy, if you did not pick up on it, is when you don't draft a running back with at least your first 4 picks, I would consider zero running back. Some would even go further than that, but I definitely think that I would start the consideration for zero running back as your first running back drafted was round 5 or later, because, into round 5, we're talking like picks in the 50s. We're talking outside the top 20 running backs likely. So that would be what I would classify as zero RB, but some people will go even further than that. The contention behind going zero RB is that early round running backs are more likely to bust than early round receivers. Last year, the stats somewhat bore that out. Last year, at the end of the season, 4 of the top 10 running backs in PPR scoring were drafted as a top 10 running back. So pretty much 40% of the drafted top 10 ended in the actual top 10. It gets a little bit worse, though. 8 of the top 20 running backs in ADP finished outside of the top 25 running backs at their position. Now, injuries have a lot to do with this, and I tend to leave injuries a little bit out of my evaluations personally because you never know when somebody's going to get hurt. But it's definitely a little bit of a red flag that many running backs did end up busting. The wide receiver position was much more stable. Only 2 of the top 10 wide receivers finished outside the top 30 PPR wide receivers, and both of them, Cooper Kupp Kupp and Justin Jefferson were injury-based. They were effective players when they played, and they both had big-time games when they were actually active that ended up starting on your best ball lineup when they played in games. Now, here's another reason that makes zero running back make sense. When it comes to zero running back, wide receiver injuries are significantly less impactful if you are stacking the team of your top wide receivers anyway. We mentioned that injury to Justin Jefferson last year. Well, if you had Justin Jefferson, but you also drafted TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Addison, then you got a huge boost from those two guys while Justin Jefferson was out. So even though you were missing out on those points from Jefferson, you were still raking in a ton of points from Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson, and maybe even a supplementary piece like KJ Osborne. So that's another reason why zero RB makes sense is if you draft a big-time running back and he gets hurt, you're kind of up a creek without a paddle. But if you draft a big-time wide receiver and he gets hurt, if you're constructing your team around stacks, you have guys that are going to benefit from that wide receiver's injury anyway. Now, zero running back also lessens your player pool, which makes it more likely that you end on players who hit. What I mean by that is this: if you're truly going zero running back, then in the first 2 rounds, you have significantly less options to draft because Christian McCaffrey is going in the first round, Bijan Robinson is going in the first round, and then you've got like Saquon Barkley, you've got Kyren Williams, you've got Jahmyr Gibbs, other running backs that are going in the first 2 rounds that if you're going zero running back, you are just crossing off of your list. And so what that means is you have significantly less options. And so if you have significantly less options, then there's less combinations of players that you can draft. And it's much more likely that you end up ending on a combination in those first 4 rounds that end up hitting just because you're Xing out a lot of players, right? Now that's kind of the mathy explanation to it. But really, zero running back, that's the bottom line, is by going zero running back, let me rephrase. By going zero running back, you're drafting wide receivers that if they get hurt, you end up getting their points anyway. And if you draft a running back that gets hurt, you are screwed. And if you're going zero running back, you're likely drafting a lot of backup running backs. If those starting running backs do get hurt, then you're raking in the bonus points from that because now you've got the starting running back and you didn't draft any of that starting running back. The downside to zero RB is that you're going to miss out on the most elite running backs, like Christian McCaffrey, who last year finished 100 PPR points above any other running back and was a big piece on a ton of finalist teams in Best Ball Mania 4, along with a lot of other best ball tournaments. So if you're going zero running back, you're definitely going to have your convictions and you're going to have to get it right. I see the merits to zero running back. I've done a few zero running back builds myself. The one that I had last year that made the finals was not a zero running back build, but I definitely think that it's a viable strategy. I don't think it's like this some gospel strategy that you have to do, but I definitely think it's a viable strategy that's worth looking into, especially if you are constructing your roster around a bunch of stacks. Now, at the end of the day, if you want to make best ball a profitable experience, what you're going to want to do is you can use all the strategies that we've talked about, and you could still end up not being profitable if you don't set up everything the right way. What you need to do is you need to draft a lot. And I'm, not here and tell you have to spend a certain amount of money or whatever. I do a lot of the cheap drafts on Best Ball and on Underdog and DraftKings personally, just because I would rather draft a lot of cheap lineups than just a few Best Ball Mania lineups. And I'm a high school teacher by day, so I don't have a ton of disposable income, especially now that I've got a baby at home that requires a lot of diapers and a lot of attention. So doing the cheap best ball drafts is for me, but I like drafting a lot because what that allows you to do is it allows you to draft from each position on the board and end up with different combinations of players from each position on the board, where you end up with different stacks and different players, and just it kind of increases the amount that you're going to end up on a combination that is going to advance to the playoffs and going to do well once it gets to the playoffs. I also think mixing up your exposures in all areas of the draft is a very solid idea. Don't necessarily always pick the same guy. If you're at pick 8 to like 3 drafts in a row, don't always pick the same quarterback and same wide receiver combinations. Like just mix it up, find different combinations, because one of those combinations is going to hit. And if you draft enough and you mixed up your players enough, you're going to end on one that does. Now, backdoor stacks is something that I do want to mention. I think that drafting with different stacks is a solid idea. Like, if, for example, you might not be able to get both Jamar Chase and T. Higgins in the same draft. And so if you draft one Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase lineup, and then you draft one Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Jermaine Burton lineup. Like, you've gotten two Bengals stacks with different variations that one of them is probably going to hit if the Bengals offense ends up being any good. But last year, backdoor stacks worked out really well. And what I mean by backdoor stacks is these were teams that were not thought of to be good offenses, like the Houston Texans, like the Green Bay Packers. And so you were able to get their quarterback and their wide receivers very late in drafts and just very easily create yourself a little stack at the end of a draft. And those ended up being very effective because those offenses ended up being a lot easier than people expected. And so getting yourself a nice little backdoor stack could be a way that you could get yourself a stack that is end up being a lot better than people perceive at their current ADP. Right now, to me, the Carolina Panthers set up as a team that would be really solid to backdoor stack. I'm a Carolina Panthers fan, so I'm a little bit biased, but basically they got a really good offensive coach who just made Baker Mayfield look really good in Tampa, and they've got a much improved offensive line, much improved wide receiver weapons around Bryce Young. And I think that offense could end up being better than people think. And the defense isn't going to be all that good. So they could end up in shootouts and games where they have to score a lot of points to win. But anyway, backdoor stacks are a strategy that you can use to get a stack for cheap and get it in your lineup and increase your ceiling that way. Lastly, don't be afraid to scroll down. So basically, with what we talked about with ADPs earlier, don't always draft the guy at the top of the ADP when it gets to you, when it's your turn. Everybody's going to be doing that. And so if you scroll down, you get a little bit different. You're going to end up on different combinations of players that not everybody's going to have. And that could be the difference in making it or, winning a final in a best ball tournament. Like last year, we talked about all these Amari Cooper teams ended up in the final. All these Christian McCaffrey teams ended up in the final. And so if you had those guys, what it came down to was, how were you different from the rest? How did you have a combination of players that ended up being better than them in week 17? And so don't be afraid to scroll down. Don't be afraid to get unique. It's a big thing that you can do in order to increase your ceiling and your ability to profit in best ball. All right, so that does it for this episode. We went a little bit longer than expected, but hopefully you guys got a ton of information and a ton of strategies that you can use for best ball drafting for the 2024 NFL season. If you like what you heard here in this episode, please hit the like button on YouTube and please rate and review the audio feed as well. It helps me out a ton when you guys do that. But go ahead and subscribe to the channel, whether you're listening on audio or watching on YouTube, because we're going to be coming at you with a ton of best ball content for the rest of the preseason, as well as some preseason season-long fantasy football content. We're even going to have a college fantasy football best ball episode coming up soon. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be really interesting because not a lot of people know about college football best ball, and it's very fun. So make sure to be around for all that. You're subscribed to the channel. And like I said, I'm going to be putting out the best ball rankings as well as some other best ball tools like the best ball stacking guide on my Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. So if you want access to that, go for it, or just wait until it becomes available, because like I said, it's not available yet. I've not had the time to put in all that work just yet. And then lastly, if this talked you into trying one or both of the best ball sites, DraftKings and Underdog, make sure you use the promo codes in the referral that is in the description. Get yourself that free money. It also helps me out when you do that as well, selfishly. But hey, it's getting you free money. Don't sign up for one of these accounts without getting the free money back. Like, it's just not smart business to not get free money, right? All right, so that's going to do it for this episode, guys. So like I said, hopefully I was able to help you guys a lot with drafting for this season. I'm going to be having a lot more best ball content. So thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you guys next time when I'm back for my next episode.